Great. How are you? Oh, I can't hear you all of a sudden. I think you might have muted yourself or something.
No? Can you
Oh,
hear me?
now I can. Yep. Went out.
Yeah, there's light glare. Let me just fix that really, really quickly.
You live in Brooklyn, Ella?
No.
The New York City area?
Yeah, I'm in Manhattan.
Oh, nice.
All right, you ready to go?
Yeah.
Cool. So, as always, this is Ella Sterone reporting for James Cole. Today, we have a very declarative statement. Higher education is dying. Here's why. So, I would love to open the floor to you. Um, what
I got to start preparing for these. I've got to start looking at what we're going to discuss before we discuss it.
Yeah,
But
I think it was
this is bringing me back to high school where we're like, today we're talking about The Great Gatsby. And I'm like, I didn't read that, but let's still talk about it. Um, yeah, I have thoughts, so let's get into it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's a very declarative statement. First of all, higher education is dying. Here's why. So I would just love to know, just kind of like your thought process to how you got to that very definitive statement.
Yeah, I mean it's a true statement. I don't think it's as true as it will be, which is to say, like colleges and universities, even before COVID, were going out of business. There are too many of them, and they are too expensive. Um, and I think due to COVID, that's going to skyrocket, certainly in the next year or two. And then I think as people realize that the workforce relies on those large rubber stamps of that you went to a certain school. I think the top 100 schools, say, the ones that really have the brand name, whether it's Harvard or, you know, Williams College, or, it doesn't have to be an Ivy League per se, but a good school that has a good brand, a good school that has a good endowment, I think they will survive. But what happens is those schools, people will still aspire to get into, maybe a little bit less, but it's okay because um, the president of Harvard or where I went, Princeton, they often say like we can fill our class 3 times over with like we have good enough applicants that we could have made 3 separate classes this year. So they have plenty of fat to cut. But when there are 10% fewer applicants, Princeton has to dig into that fat a little bit. And that means fewer of those people end up going to the tier below, who has less fat, and fewer to the tier below who has less fat. And when you reach like a second or third tier school, they're not going to make their yield. They're not going to have enough students to pay tuition, and they don't have large enough endowments to cover the losses. So they're going to die.
And what was there anything that prompted this theory? How did you come across it? Was there anything in your own life that made you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm incredibly lucky in many ways to have gone to Princeton, both in terms of like what it carries in the world. I don't think that will be the case for much longer. And what I mean by that is 20, 30 years from now, going to a school like Princeton just won't carry the weight that it did 20 or 30 years. It already doesn't carry the weight that it did 30 years ago. And it will certainly carry less weight 30 years from now. I feel lucky for having the privilege to have gone there and to have that on my resume. And further, I met incredible people there. But I do think that I think the promise is not accurate, which is to say, I learned a lot about myself. I met amazing, interesting people. That much is true, but that's not really the promise. The promise is that you're getting one of the best educations in the world and access to one of the best networks in the world. And I didn't really get an education at Princeton, certainly not an actionable one to like push me towards a career. And I have very lightly used the network. So I think the price tag of 70 something $1,000 a year, which is crazy, as median income has remained largely the same over the past couple of decades, the cost of college has doubled. So I just think people can't afford it. There's $1.5 trillion of student debt. It's the second biggest debt asset class after mortgages. The average person is something like the average of age American has $35,000 of student debt. That's just a lot, to go out into the world with. And I have plenty of friends that have double or triple or quadruple that.
Do you have any student debt?
I do not.
How do you think that impacted the choices you could make in your career?
If I had a kid right now, today, who is 18, 17, wanting to go to school, if I had the money to afford to send them to Princeton, $75K a year times 4, that's a lot of money. That's $300,000 after taxes. So let's say $500K of taxable income. So $500,000 per kid. If I had that money, the kid wanted to go and it was 2020, I would still strongly consider it. But I think 10, 20 years from now, and Ella, this gets into the algorithm conversation that we keep falling back into. I think it's an important one, that like the algorithm, we've talked about this with dating apps, right? That like the recommendation engine isn't sophisticated as to recommend the kind of people I might be most compatible with to me. It's mostly just, here are people in your general vicinity, in your geo. Right now, employment decisions are based on your LinkedIn or your resume and the big things that James went to Princeton or he worked at this company, but they don't really know the details of those experiences. And as we get more refined in terms of understanding who the would-be employee is and who the employer is, what is the hole and what is the peg that fills the hole, we can more elegantly match supply and demand. And so the big ticket items like I went to Princeton will carry a lot less weight. So 20 years from now, when I probably will have an 18-year-old, I don't think I'll be sending him or her to Princeton.
What made you decide to want to go to Princeton?
I was raised in in a family and a culture where college wasn't an option. It was like, that's what you do, which is crazy because only 17% of age Americans graduate college. About 30% go and 17% matriculate. So fewer than 1 out of 5 finish college in a 10-year time horizon. So I'll be the first to say I grew up in a very rarefied culture, Princeton, New Jersey, basically, which is right next to the university, where every kid in my graduating class of high school was expected to go to college, and almost every one of them did. So I was raised just like, I'm going to go to college. And my parents met at Princeton. My aunt went to Princeton. My grandfather went to Princeton. My great-grandfather went to Princeton. So I was born with a lot of inertia. And it wasn't all like pressure. It was also like Princeton has this alumni event every year where 60,000 people come back. And it's the most elaborate reunion on planet Earth. It's a larger beer order than the Indy 500, the single biggest beer order of a private institution every year. They have bands and tents and dancing till 4 a.m. and it's a lot of fun. So I grew up going to that. I grew up going to hockey games with my grandfather. I grew up hearing stories. So for me, Princeton was always, it felt like ordained.
Did you ever have a moment where you considered other schools or other pathways?
Yes. When I was in like 10th or 11th grade and we started sort of talking about college in the school that I went to, the high school I went to, and we learned about other schools, I kind of had this, I was never an angsty kid really ever. I never really had that period. I was always like a pretty good kid. But I guess I had my version of that, which was like, fuck this. Like, why do I feel like this is the only way? There are lots of other places. I fell in love with a much smaller school. It's a top 100, certainly a top 200 school called Hamilton College in New York. I, like you, love writing, and they have a great writing program. It's tiny. It's like 2,600 kids, which is about half the size of Princeton, which is already pretty small. So it's like going to a high school. Every class is 600 or 800 people. So I liked that. I liked that it was going to be intimate. It was in like a beautiful natural setting, writing. It felt like maybe a better fit for me. So I applied to Hamilton and got in. And I heard 2 weeks later about Princeton. I applied to 3 other Ivies and got rejected from all of them. And then I got into Princeton ostensibly because of my legacy, right? Like that was enough to kind of get me from barely no to barely yes, maybe. So I had Princeton and Hamilton, and I would tell people, I still remember my high school girlfriend's mom. I was over there and she's like, oh, I heard you got into a bunch of places, what are you thinking? And I said, I got, the 2 that I'm really thinking about are Hamilton and Princeton. She's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, and I explained what I just explained to you. And she's like, go to Princeton. Like, why would you not go to Princeton? And that was sort of the attitude of everyone that I spoke to. Like, why would you sleep on the opportunity to go to the best school in the country, in the world, potentially at the time? So I went.
Do you think that pressure like shaped the trajectory of your life in any way?
Yeah, I think it's all been part of a long, and I don't mean to play the world's smallest violin here. Like this has shaped me in many positive ways, but I've been in a vice of pressure since I was 5, I was on it's a very interesting track, right? Like when you contextualize it in the larger country, I went to a private school from when I was 5 to when I was 18, the same one, for 13 years, kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And it was very intense, and I had very intense parents, and my friends' parents were intense, and Princeton's intense. So from the time that I could tie my shoes to the time I was writing 20-page papers very regularly for classes, once a week, pressure, and you're not quite enough, and you need to be better, and you need to reach up and grab the next rung of the ladder to pull yourself up through life was very much the ethos. And it's one that I'm challenging now, right? As an entrepreneur and as like a man, as someone who has left the nest and is questioning the way he was raised in a way that I think we all do.
Well, that pressure, I think, also conditions a lot of work environments. So I'm just curious, is there a benefit to kind of experiencing that pressure as it prepares you for your work and your career in any way? And is that something you would want other people to experience?
Yeah. One of my friends is an engineer, and he loves sailing. He actually just rebuilt an old sailboat that he bought for a couple grand, and he repaired it and repaired it and repaired it. COVID has given him, he needed 1,000 hours. He put in 1,000 hours this summer and repaired it. And we were out sailing once, and he described how sailing works, which is, you have the wind pushing the sail, and then you have the centerboard or keel in the water, and there's resistance the other way. So he basically described that there are 2 vectors like this, and it's like squeezing a watermelon seed, and it pushes it forward. Even if the wind is coming in like this and the water is pushing back, it pushes you this way. It's sort of a miracle, right? Because the wind almost feels like it should be pushing you backwards, but because you have the pressure from the other side, you're able to progress forwards in the direction you want to go. And so, yeah, like the pressure I was raised with was definitely one vector, but without another one, which I would describe as like your own self-imposed goals, ideals, framework to sort of counteract it, which I think has pushed me forward, it can really push you back. And I've watched a lot of friends crumble from our very high octane, high intensity day school. I've watched a lot of kids crack under that. And some have just full on cracked, like they full on broken down, like they just couldn't handle it anymore. But the more common and more sad almost story is like malaise, people who are sleepwalking through life and they're doing fine on paper. They have a job and it pays them decent money and so on, but like they don't, when you talk to them, they're not connected to what they're doing or the people that they're with, or they're just sort of, it's like the flame inside them has been put out because what sustained them for so long was that intensity. So they never had to develop their own inner drive.
I also want to circle back to student debt because there's $1.7 trillion worth of student debt,
Right.
and it's seven now.
Is it really?
Yeah, which is by the magnitudes of hundreds of billions. It's a big, big number. And that number affects a lot of people. 2/3 of those student debt holders are women. People of color typically have to take out more predatory loans than white people. And so there's all these compounding factors. As you noted that, you don't have student debt, whereas I do. And I've never been able to kind of, take time off work or, follow passions that, it's just always kind of been like a compounding thing because I have this looming thing in the background of, oh, I have debt. To that end, and so I kind of wanted to circle back, do you think the fact that you don't have student debt has allowed you to take some risks or like take some chances? And if so, what are those? Like being able to move, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, listen, if as I said, if I had a kid right now and I could not afford to send them to college, I would strongly question whether it was worth myself or them going into debt. I do not think the trade is worth it. Like, I don't think the price tag on these educations redeems itself. Like, I certainly haven't made in salary what was spent on my Princeton education. So let's just say all of that was debt. I would not be in the black yet. I would still be in debt. Right.
Right. So I'm just wondering, are there any chances that you've taken in your career or in life? Like,
yeah, all of them, right? Like I've been able to not have to make decisions. Like one of my best friends, I was talking, actually, I'm having dinner with him tonight. Is in a large, 6 figures of debt from Princeton, which is unusual, by the way, because Princeton covers a lot more than most schools. 6 figures of debt from Princeton. And he is very artistic and creative, but has had to get jobs in finance and other like careers that aren't as interesting to him to try to get this number fucking down. I haven't had to make sacrifices like that. Like, I've been able to pursue exactly what I want to pursue because I don't have that burden over my head. So was the Princeton experience additive? Yeah. Like I said, I met really awesome people. I had 4 years to kind of incubate myself and grow up and just learn about who I am. So I'm grateful for that. Was the education I received worth 300 grand? Just full on transaction? No, I don't think it was. So I don't think it's worth the price tag is what I'm saying. So if you have the privilege to do it, know that it's an inefficient use of funds. I think it's like you spend 300 grand, you get value. I don't think you get 300 grand of value, most people. So to me, it's not worth the trade. So I did it, but it's out of privilege, right? It's like I did it because I could, because I was raised in a community where it was expected I would go, and my parents were willing to pay and could pay in full. And so I went, but now being older, wiser, more aware of this sort of stuff, like if my parents were even close to not being able to afford it, I'd be like, don't fucking do it, man. Like, I'm going to be fine. Right. But the way they were raised, you wouldn't be fine. If you didn't go to college 20, 30 years ago, that held you way down in society. And I don't think in 20 years it will. I have 4 employees, 4, and not one of them went to college. I'm the only one on my whole team at my company who went to college at all.
What do you think kind of precipitated that shift, whether it's generationally or culturally, that, college actually, there's so many other things that are just as important as colleges to whether somebody can be.
Yeah, I mean, the internet's got to be one of the biggest 2 or 3 factors, right? Like just the proliferation, the readily available mountain of information, right? Like getting an education used to mean that you had to go to an institution that held the knowledge to get the knowledge. But if you want to learn about something today, you can learn about it. There are all kinds of courses. Like if you want to be a graphic designer, you want to be whatever, you can get that education online for $500 for free, you can get it just by scrappily being a freelancer and eating shit and making mistakes and working for $30 an hour and working your way up. Like, I really do believe if you wanted to be a graphic designer or you wanted to run Facebook ads or whatever, that you could literally know almost nothing, read some articles online, start on Upwork or Fiverr or whatever at $20 an hour, and just work your way up. And within a year or 2, you could be making 6 figures as a freelancer using those platforms without an education. I really believe that.
On the flip side of freelancers, of course, is bosses, and you are in the space as an entrepreneur and as a owner of a company where you are hiring people. And as you said, your employees don't have these traditional college educations, but you hire them, so they're still clearly very qualified. What advice would you have for bosses or hiring managers or whomever who just can't get over this, oh, well, they have to go to college mentality?
Just you learn. I think if you're open-minded to it, that there's a correlation between, like, listen, to get into Princeton is hard. Like it's, 8%, 9% of applicants get accepted. So you have to, and again, you're young, you're 17, 18 when you're applying, like what have you really done? But like to get a very high SAT score, to have a good GPA at a competitive school, like you have to be somewhat formidable. You can't be a schlub. So getting into Princeton means something. It means that you're like able, you're relatively intelligent. You're probably more intelligent than the average person. So it's a good, that's what I'm saying. It's like a big lever. We have fine knobs in our world now where I can be like, I need a Facebook ad manager who's very data oriented. I can really find a very specific person, not just a broad spectrum smart person who went to Harvard. So for me, like there was a correlation between someone having gone to a good school and them broadly being smart and able, and they've been under pressure before and they've written a long paper or taken a hard test, so that is where I shopped first, right? Like when I interviewed people, I'd try to make sure that they had impressive things on their resume. But I've had 35 people work for me probably since starting the company, and the 4 left standing are the 4 with grit, with like, they can just take hits. They can get punched in the mouth again and again and again and keep coming back. And those kids happen to have not gone to college. I think it's a coincidence that all 4 of them. But if you told me half would have and half wouldn't have, I'd believe you, right? Like grit, the ability to keep fighting, to push through, to take on challenges with intrigue, excitement, dynamism, some of that is biological or psychological insofar as it was rooted from a very young age. Like without betraying confidence, most of the people that work for me have a deep pathology, you can tell, where they need to prove something to themselves, to the world, for different reasons. And I have a sense of what it is because I know them quite well, as do I, by the way. And so to make it at a small, scrappy startup, like, you have to fucking want it. You can't have just like gone to MIT and you're smart and that's going to carry you through. You have to have that fire. That's what I was talking about with the two vectors. Like, just being under a lot of pressure and writing papers at Harvard does not an inspired, passionate person make. And you need both. You need to have had some form of education, whether it's a formal one or getting it on the job or what have you, and an inner drive and desire. And a lot of these kids that get into Princeton think that that means the world owes them something. Like, I talk to young Princeton kids all the time because I stay involved. And there's an entitlement. Like, I have this thing. I went to Princeton University. It's like, fuck off. You don't have this thing. So I don't get near me, man. Like, unless you can hack it and you have the passion and the will and the desire and the ability to get punched in the mouth and get back up, you're going to die. And every impressive kid on paper that I've hired has fallen by the wayside, some very quickly at my company.
What is that thing that drives you?
Probably the inverse of what drives my employees, right? So, like, in broad strokes, if you didn't go to college, if you didn't come from much, you think that you're deep down, that you have something inside you that's great, you resent the fact that society hasn't acknowledged it and you want to show them in some way. And I'm sort of the opposite. Like, I resent the fact, you might not like this analogy, Ella, but I'll make it anyway. Like, I've met plenty of beautiful people, women and men, who are just stunningly attractive through the nature of what I do. And some of them haven't had to learn to exercise some of the muscles underneath that because the world just stops at their beauty. They get into places, they get opportunities, they get dates, they get what they want based on the fact that people are attracted to them. And they might be really interesting or smart or talented, but people don't bother to dig to find that. They just stop at the beauty. And my privilege, I'm fourth generation to go to Princeton, and that's a fucking headline. That puts me in some box that, like, I'm some entitled prick. And I'm like, yeah, that's true, I guess. But I'm also going to outwork you. And I want it fucking bad. Like, I want it worse than you do. So for me, it's sort of like undoing some of the damage of my surface level, like what someone might think of me if they were to just look at my resume or hear my story, the one I just told you. I'm not going to hide and say that I don't have privilege, because I do, but I also will show the fuck up. Like, I'm not going to ride on the coattails of that privilege. I'm going to do right by it and work my ass off.
I've found that one of the most effective ways to abuse the notions that come along with that privilege is to keep the door open for other people. And so I'm curious that, whether through your hiring practices or your kind of, I don't want to say, like, maybe evangelism is too strong a word, but it's also 7 a.m. of just, kind of pushing against this idea of that you need to go to college. How are you kind of, working to make space to undo these just standards?
I think, like, I really, like, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. Like, I think this is how everyone should be. And it's just how I am. It's not like I'm trying to be this way. Like, I always say to my team, like, the best idea should win. Like, I don't care where it comes from. Like, I don't have any expectation as to who is gonna, like, I just want good people. I want good soldiers. I want people that care and work hard and are earnest. And I don't care where they come from. I don't care if they're male or female. I don't care their race. I don't care if they went to college or not. I don't care about anything. I just care about the quality of the soldier. Um, and different people are shaped by different experiences. Maybe my leadership style, because I'm somewhat of a masochist and I'm hard on myself, like I'm drawn to people who are hard on themselves. And maybe the reason why 4 out of 4 of my employees didn't go to college, like maybe I'm drawn to people who feel like they've been held down by the world a little bit and are pushing back. And I like that. I like that hunger that comes with that, and like I'm weird because I don't need that. I could have gotten a job paying me $150K at some consulting firm. I wouldn't have liked it, but I could have done it. Like I got the stamps from society and I was born into the right family and to the right lane where I could have just sort of floated through. But I chose to walk this sort of entrepreneur's path. And you know me well enough by now to know that I walk this path of like, I try like nakedness, like deep self-awareness, like deep questioning of self, trying to be your best, trying to push like and bring the best out of yourself, and not to ride on the benefits that come along with a big rubber stamp that says Princeton University or whatever else the stamp. Like I've gotten a lot of stamps, but I don't hold that passport out. Like I keep it in my pocket. Like I want to show up and impress people on the merits of how I act, not what college I went to.
Is there anything that you did learn at college that you're very grateful for? Like any good classes, any good lessons?
I don't know why, Ella, but I didn't go to class. I skipped 90% of my classes. And to this day, I'm pretty like into analyzing myself and trying to figure out why we do the things we do. I don't really know why that is. I don't know if it was laziness, if it was disinterest, if it was fear. Like maybe if I didn't try and I got a B, that was better than trying my hardest and getting a B, because I could always lie to myself and say, well, I could have done better if I wanted. I don't know. I don't know why, but the truth is I skipped 90% of my lectures. I really didn't. I went to small seminars, which are most of the classes, particularly as you get older at Princeton. So I went to those. I wouldn't do hardly any of the readings. I did the bare minimum I had to get by. And I was scrappy enough to get by, not just get by, but do pretty well. But I hacked the whole system. Like I didn't follow the rules. So I guess it taught me how to do that. Someone recently told me entrepreneurship is about half your days being a pirate and half being a Navy SEAL. And I was a pirate all through college. I was just plundering. I was breaking the rules, being irreverent, learning how to get by and hack the system. Now I'm much more of a Navy SEAL. Like it's much less sort of like freewheel plunder and much more discipline and intensity. So I didn't learn a whole lot from my classes is the punchline. I did have to write a lot of 20-page research papers. So I got pretty good at, an hourglass is how I always thought of it. Like, it's kind of an interesting emotional experience. Like you have an hourglass here. When you write a 20-page research paper, you have to read, 50 sources, really do your research and go really wide. And you sort of bring all of that down to an understanding, a thesis, a point, a consolidated opinion on a subject matter. And then you open it back up into a 20-page paper. But like starting very wide, wrapping your head around a thought, consolidating it down, and then executing it into something, that's a good muscle. So maybe that, I learned how to do that. So all day long, Ella, I get hit with things as an entrepreneur where I have to really wrap my head around what's happening, consolidate it down, make a decision, and then figure out what I or my team needs to do to bring something to life. So consolidating information and then executing it back out and doing that fast and quickly. I got a lot of reps in it at school. But mostly it was just the lie of what Princeton offers still attracts a lot of people. And frankly, the best people, the best runners, the best musicians, the best chemists. So my classmates were all the best of the best of the best, you know? And so I was rubbing elbows with and learning from and sharpening my thinking against a very densely packed, we're all in dorms and dining halls and right next to each other. Like, I spent pretty much nonstop 4 years with very formidable people that challenged me and made me better. So that was the greatest gift, is just being around people that make me better.
This idea that there is a constant scramble to get into a good school, and people do so many things. They take all these extra SAT prep classes. They spend a lot of money basically to get into a good school. And then you get there and it's often very downhill. You know, a lot of people can coast. And so that kind of wind up to nothing, has that influenced your theory on why, there's going to be this reckoning with colleges?
Yeah, I mean, like everyone says, right? Like there's a common expression, the hardest part about getting in, the hardest part about Princeton is getting in. Hardest part about Harvard is getting in. I think it's true, right? It's really hard. And I work with young kids sometimes, high schoolers that reach out to me, or I just give a talk at a thing with a bunch of high schoolers. And there's so much pressure, man. Like, I remember people saying this to me 12 years ago or whenever I was applying to college, like, I never would have gotten in today. It's so much harder today. I remember them saying that then, and I'm now feeling that way. Like, wow, these poor kids, like they are killing themselves. They're so whipped up about getting into the right school. And it's funny because like getting in and paying tuition, like you have to get in, you have to pay the tuition checks, and you have to not fail out. And then you get your stamp. So getting in is definitely the hardest part. You get in, you don't stiff the school, and you don't fail out. And then you graduate and you get to say, I went to Harvard. And that supposedly does something. My Princeton education hasn't done anything for me at all. At all. The piece of paper, the diploma, right? Like the lessons I learned have, but I used to get teased at Young and Rubicam, which is one of the biggest ad agencies in the world and a place where probably used to be predominantly Ivy League students. I was like the only one. There was one dude who was in his 50s who went to Princeton, but out of the hundreds of people I worked with, no one else went to an Ivy League school. No one, not one, except for this one older gentleman. There were thousands of employees, right? Like they all went to state schools or, whatever. And they would tease me for having gone to Princeton. Like it was a bad thing, like, oh, Mr. Princeton, da, 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 da. So it kind of worked against me. I was kind of like, I was kind of ostracized for having that privilege. It certainly doesn't do anything in entrepreneurship. It's not like people give a fuck where I went to college, right? Day to day. So, and now you know this well, like the zeitgeist is very much pushing back against privilege, pushing back against so I think it's something that I should sort of be closeted about. Like we're doing this talk right now, but like I never ever ever like wear my Princeton pin on my chest, so to speak. Like I never lead with that, or even I sort of am embarrassed when people find out. There's a joke, Ella, for Princeton students where a lot of times people will say, where did you go to college? And people will say New Jersey. And they'll be like, oh, Rutgers? And you'll be like, no, and then they'll find out and you look like an idiot for trying to hide it. But people try to hide it sometimes. Like they don't want people to know that they went to Princeton because it's embarrassing. That's sort of where we're at societally.
Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing. It's, it's a correction. It's like society pushing back against what was true, which was 50 years ago, if you went to Princeton, you could work any job and you were in the upper echelons of society. You were a privileged white man who could do as he pleased. But like, that's not what Princeton is anymore. 65% of Princeton students are on financial aid. 70% of high school valedictorians are women. Princeton, I think, is more, I think, I'd have to check this, is either more Asian than white, or certainly disproportionately Asian vis-a-vis Gen Pop than white. Right? It's not an old white men's club anymore. That's what it was 50 years ago. And that reputation sticks with it to this day, but it's not like that. It's like a very young, dynamic, diverse group of people, very, very diverse in every sense of the word, socioeconomically, racially, you name it. Very much so right now. But it didn't used to be that way. So I think there's been a correction, as with a lot of social movements right now, like a correction against the way things used to be, which is healthy.
Gonna go back to one of my other questions and now flip it. Is there anything that you learned or that you wish you had learned while you were at Princeton that really would have served you better throughout your career?
Yeah, I think a huge miss is like like understanding where this goes. Like, what is this for exactly? Where is this going? What is out there? I was joking with one of my friends recently that went to Princeton. I was like, you didn't know that your job existed. I didn't know that my job existed. It wasn't like I devalued it or something. I simply didn't know it was out there. Like, I didn't even know it was an option. Like, I didn't know what a marketplace was. I didn't know much about entrepreneurship at all. It was just something that happened in California. Like, I did, you know the big ones. You know what, like a doctor and a lawyer and a consultant and a banker. Like those things. But there's so many careers out there that are permutations. Like different things. Like one of my good friends, she works as she comes up with what movie options there are on Delta airline flights. Like that's her job, is negotiating with all the studios and like getting the right movie options. Like that's her profession. It's like she didn't know that existed when she was 18. So in Europe, 30% of people that go to school go to trade school and they learn a trade. They become a plumber, they become a whatever. I don't know enough about it to say I'm a big fan, but I directionally like what like a General Assembly is. General Assembly? General Assembly is like a very trendy thing. It started in Union Square. It's in Brooklyn, a couple other places. It might even be outside of New York City now. It's like a sort of like hipsters mostly. It's like hip, young, like, or even someone like you, Ella, like, hip, young, with it, talented, in their late 20s, early 30s, a lot of times wanting to make a career change. You take a 6-week intensive where you learn how to be a UI UX designer or a copywriter, or it's like a modern sexy trade school where they teach you like very hard skills that you can then take to become a designer, a developer, or a writer, whatever, right? They have courses for maybe 15 different things. And you pay $6,000 and you get like a thing from GA, General Assembly, which means something. Like it's a well-respected institution. And it's $6,000 and you learn a hard skill and you can switch careers. And like that to me feels like a good transaction. Spending $6,000 to learn how to be a UI UX designer to get the job that you really want. That makes sense to me. And so I wish that I'd learned more about what was out there professionally. And I wish that Princeton had done a better job preparing me and my peers for the job market, as opposed to holding on high this idea that a liberal arts education and learning about philosophy and whatever makes a well-rounded thinker and you'll figure it out later.
I do want to touch on this idea of trade schools because this is something I think about a lot. My brother is an electrician. He never went to college, but he did join a union and learned that way. And he and I joke all the time that, well, he's never going to be able to get laid off because everybody's always going to need an electrician, whereas you can go on Fiverr and outsource me. And so I'm curious, but at the same time, there is this just diminishing interest in people joining these trade schools, at least in the United States, and learning these very traditional trades, which is probably going to at some point have a conflict point in society where there's not going to be enough bus drivers, there's not going to be enough people who really keep society moving. And so I'm just curious, you know, as people keep on holding these more creative, lofty pursuits on high, what your thoughts are there.
I'm a huge proponent of trade schools. And I mean it in the old school sense of like a trade being that you're a mason or an electrician or like some of the other things you mentioned. Like, as you said, these are infrastructural parts of our society. Like, we need electricians, we need plumbers, like we need people that have those hard skills, because if something minor happens with my sink, I can probably fix it. But anything more than that, like an auto mechanic, like you name it, like these are people that keep us up and running. So that's very needed. But I think new age trade schools where, like, I don't know much about your educational background, Ella, but like, you know, how do you learn to become a talented writer or interviewer, right? Like that's something that could be sharpened into an education, and affordably, you know, for $5,000, $10,000, you get not everything, like a lot of it's experience and learning on the job. Same thing for an electrician or whatever, but you get the basic skills to start a career on that path, as opposed to spending $300,000 going to school and learning everything from art history to philosophy to what have you, to then maybe sort of find a career as a writer, to then try to make that 300K back and stay in student debt. Like that's fucked up. That's what's going to die. So if you want to be a writer, you should just learn those hard skills at a trade school, which again could be an old school trade school or a general assembly type thing. But I think there'll be more educational things that are actually educational, where they teach you one thing and one thing only, and you get really good at it and you can make a career off of it. And within a year or two of working the career, you should have paid for your education, as opposed to now where it's 10 or 20 years of work before you've paid off your student debt in some cases. Like that's fucked up.
Do you think schools are going to have to bring the prices of their educations back down?
I'm sort of pulling numbers out of my ass, but I think it's fun, and we'll have a clip of me saying it. I think by 2030, half of four-year colleges will have gone out of business. 50% of current four-year colleges will be gone by 2030. What the rest of them do, again, I think the top 50, top 100 are safe. Like they have, you know, there's this guy that talks about this that I really like, Scott Galloway. He's like the best thinker on this. He's a tenured professor at NYU Stern, which is a top 10 business school. It's NYU's business school. And he says that higher education is, you know, those brands are the biggest luxury brands of our time. You buy a Porsche, you buy an Apple Watch. These companies have 40 or 50% profit margins because they're luxury goods with a fat premium on top. Education, he's like, to take my class, you're paying a 92% premium. Like what the school pays me, all of the costs for the school versus what they're charging you for that class, it's 92% more than it needs to be for them to break even. And there's not a single luxury good on planet Earth that has a 92% premium. A Porsche has a 40% premium. So those premium name brands, Harvard University, like I think it'll be around for 20 to 50 years. I think my grandkids, you know, will spit in the eye of Harvard probably. So 50% will be gone. of the remaining, you know, the top 10%, let's say, will be okay. And the bottom 90%, yeah, will probably have to lower their pricing.
I also want to touch on something that you said earlier, that you're not using your network that Princeton ostensibly promised you. When I went to college, I could not tell you where the Career Center even was. It just wasn't on my radar. And so I'm curious, in absence of this resource that colleges always promise their students, what have you used and what advice would you give to young people trying to build these networks on their own?
I think networking, sales, and dating are really hard things because if you try too hard at them, if you're too salesy, like that, no one likes that. Like the used car salesman vibe, no one likes that. If you're like going to things and handing out your business card and wheeling and dealing and being too aggressive, no one likes that. If you're like dating like a maniac and dating too much and treating dating as this transactional sort of for sport thing, no one likes that. The key to dating is like connecting with the person that you're sitting across from. The key to networking is really like being interested in people. The key to sales is like listening to the other person and their pain points and really trying to help. So like an earnestness and honesty is how you network, is how you sell, is how you date. So for me, like my network have been like people that I authentically have connected with over the past 5 to 10 years, who authentically I like, and in most cases have helped, and in return they helped me. And like that's the only network that I want or that has served me. But simply having a network because we went to the same school, uh, I haven't, and maybe you can leverage that more, and I just haven't, but that hasn't been something I've experienced. Um, so I think my advice would just be like, be an earnest human who is open to connecting with people and giving. Put value, plant seeds, put value out in the world, not manipulatively, but earnestly. Like help people when you can, and then those seeds will bloom. You know, something I really admire about my dad's career is that he's built lots of different relationships, and when I watch him work now, most of his job is just connecting good people that he knows. And I always watch his deals with high regard because usually everyone walks away feeling like they won. This party was connected to this party and my dad made the introduction, and this party's like, wow, I can't believe, like, I feel like I got away with one there. And this party feels the same. And my dad hasn't burned any bridges. On the contrary, he's strengthened his relationships with both parties. And I think if you can build a network, really know the people in your network and thoughtfully help people, that's how you continue to strengthen your network. And then when the time comes and you need to ask favors from people, or you can. One of my favorite things about what I do, Ella, like this whole future of work thing, is like, I know a lot of people like yourself, like incredibly talented freelancers that are it's a trade school thing, like that are fucking good at what they do. Design, development, copywriting. I'm working on a project right now for a client with a copywriter that I worked at Y&R with, who's 60, with a designer that worked at the Hub for a bit, and he's 30, with another designer who I met through a friend of a friend. You know, I have another project right now where I brought in another designer, a photographer. So the point is, like, I have this whole network of freelancers that I really respect, that are the best at what they do. And I love bringing in those people and having like a shape-shifting agency where the client gives me a problem and I pull in Susie, Joey, and Frank, and that's the dream team that's going to solve the problem. That's like my favorite thing to do.
And then my last question for you is, if you were talking to, and I'm sure you do this all the time, as you said, but if you were talking to a high school senior who's weighing their options and trying to figure out a lot of very high pressure answers at 17, what advice would you give them?
Yeah. So one of my 4 employees is 17 and he is a grinder. So I treat him like he's 25, but he's 17. He just turned 17. He's a senior in high school. And he's like, he called me the other day. He's like, I never considered not going to school until I started working at the hub. I don't think I want to go to school now. And I'm like, whoa, dude, like, take it easy. Um, I've gotten to know him, right? And when he first told me that, I didn't know enough about him. And if he told me that he got into school number 542 on the list of US News and World Report schools, like a mediocre school, middle of the road school, I'd say, yeah, man, if you feel connected to what we're doing and I can tell you with confidence that we're going to be around for 2 to 4 years, don't go to school. Turns out he's up for a national merit scholarship and he's brilliant and he might go to Columbia. And so what I've advised him to do, just to answer your question with a real situation, because this isn't hypothetical for me. Hi, Gabby. Is I said to him, apply to Columbia, get into Columbia, get the acceptance. I asked him when the date to defer is. He told me May. And I said, keep working here, work really hard until May. Let's see how much we can afford to pay you. Let's see how well you're doing. Let's see how much you enjoy it. And you can defer school for a year in May if that's what you want to do. And that's just a year of a free option to go to Columbia or keep working with us. And you can punt it down the road a year. So apply to Columbia, get in, have that option, see how you feel about the company, stay at the hub. If you feel that that's a better education, at least for a year, then you can go to Columbia, or you can permanently not go to Columbia if we really take off. So that's the advice I gave him, is like, if it was a middle of the road school, I'd say skip it. It's not worth the money, but it's Columbia. So I think it's still probably worth it unless he feels that he has something better going on, which he might with my company. It just depends.
That takes us to time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ella. Have a good rest of your day.
A good one.